Morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I'm going to start by reading the Indigenous Water Acknowledgement written for the Freshwater Collaborative by the Electa Quinney Institute at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. As a system of universities in Wisconsin, we share stewardship of the land and water between the Michigami, the full system of Great Lakes, and Michizzibi, the Great Mississippi River, with the current sovereign nations of Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Ojibwe, Oneida, and Mohican people, along with the ancestors before them. Together, we commit to being connected to this space, increasing our knowledge of it, and transmitting that knowledge to future generations. Thank you so much for being a part of this. So thank you all for joining groundwater researchers and policy experts today from Wisconsin, Illinois, and Michigan for this virtual Great Lakes Freshwater Symposium. Panelists will discuss the groundwater policy developments and challenges in their states and what kind of research is needed related to factors such as managing agricultural contaminants and PFAS. Panelists include Rachel Burns from the Environmental Quality Specialist, Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, Steve Elmore, the Program Director for the Bureau of Drinking Water and Groundwater from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, and Walton Kelly, the Head of Groundwater Science Section at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. This event is part of a quarterly water symposium series sponsored by the Freshwater Collaborative of Wisconsin and the Great Lakes Higher Education Consortium and the Council of the Great Lakes Region. It is being recorded, and so we can share this recording afterwards with people who aren't able to attend. And these events seek to encourage and advance collaborations, share science across borders, encourage students in research and career opportunities, and present research that is solving real-world problems. So without further ado, we would love to get the panel started by hearing from Rachel Burns.
There we go. And good afternoon. My name is Rachel Burns with the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. We're also known as EAGLE for short. I'm with the Water Resources Division, and I am the Groundwater Program Specialist for the state of Michigan. So my personal expertise is in the realm of permitting and enforcing compliance with our groundwater discharge permit. So I'm with the Part 22 Groundwater Discharge Program. I will preface this presentation by saying that although my name is on these slides, this was definitely a group project here to get all the information pulled together. So we have various programs in the state of Michigan that interact with groundwater. So I had several coworkers who helped me pull information together that you'll see in these slides. Particular thanks to Jim Milne, who's with the Water Use Program. And I am old school, so you'll see me looking to the side just a little bit here. I've got paper copies of my notes. But with that, I will go into the first slide. Maybe. There it goes. With the first question being, who are the primary agencies and organizations involved in groundwater policy and research in your state? So in Michigan, the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, or otherwise known as EAGLE, we are the primary groundwater regulatory authority, and therefore we are also the primary groundwater policy maker in the state. EAGLE includes multiple different offices and divisions. So one of the first that I'll introduce is the Office of the Great Lakes. They really help to pull together our overall policy for the state within EAGLE, and then also the individual work that each of our divisions does. For divisions, we've got the Drinking Water and Environmental Health Division, the Materials Management Division, the Oil, Gas, and Minerals Division, Remediation and Redevelopment Division, and then Water Resources Division. So that last one is the one that I'm a member of. As the names kind of give away, each of our divisions do or focus on something slightly different, but all of them interact with groundwater either through groundwater protection, groundwater use, trying to address groundwater contamination. They all interact with groundwater in at least one way, if not multiple ways. For groundwater research, the primary agencies or groups that are doing research on groundwater within the state of Michigan are the United States Geological Survey, the Michigan Geological Survey, multiple universities, and then we also have research being done by nonprofit environmental organizations. For one of the next questions that we had on what are the biggest challenges your state is dealing with in terms of groundwater. So in Michigan, when we start talking about challenges and groundwater, the very first thing we have to bring up and talk about is the complex glacial geology that underlies a good portion of our state. At this time, the glacial geology is still relatively poorly understood from a three-dimensional perspective. There are some areas of the state where there have been more in-depth mapping and investigation efforts made of the groundwater, and we kind of know what that below ground landscape looks like. It's a little bit better understood in those areas. But for much of the state, it's still really kind of a mystery of what's going on and kind of exactly where things are moving. They move in unexpected ways. A large part of that also, the state of Michigan is blessed with a lot of surface water. So we have a lot of groundwater, surface water connections, interactions, venting kind of scenarios, which make things interesting. We also, because of the glacial geology, have deeper regional groundwater flow in some areas, which again, keeps it interesting when you're trying to guess where water is going to be moving and what the impacts are going to be if you have discharges in certain areas. We also have a issue or challenge in our state where we have a fair amount of groundwater data, both the data that's been collected by various state agencies and by the universities, nonprofits, so folks kind of in that academic realm. But the data is unfortunately siloed, where we kind of have it living in these different areas, but we don't have it all in one easy to access location where we can kind of see that larger picture. And unfortunately, we see that both with some of the older paper data that we have and with the more modern electronic data, where it's just kind of separate and hard to see the larger picture. We do have some aquifer sustainability issues. So despite the large amounts of groundwater and surface water that we have, like everywhere else, of course, we have multiple competing demands for groundwater in particular. So we are seeing aquifer sustainability issues, both in our bedrock aquifers and in our glacial aquifers. And then we also have groundwater quality issues. Not unique at all to Michigan, unfortunately, but we do have an assortment of groundwater quality issues like PFAS and other emerging pollutants. Microplastics is another big one that we have coming up right now. We have groundwater contamination sites, and we've seen in Michigan, so we have the more traditional kind of industrial related contamination issues where an industry, a facility discharged a pollutant, maybe in the past not knowing what was going on, or perhaps trying to get rid of something, gets to the ground and then ultimately gets to the groundwater. We've also found in Michigan, though, that we have discharges that don't necessarily fit into that kind of more classical model, where we actually have facilities that are discharging high strength waste, either a high biological oxygen demand content to it, or just a high strength or high organic content to that wastewater. And then what we find sometimes is so even though it itself is not carrying pollutants, once it hits the ground, gets down to the groundwater, we see chemical reactions within the aquifer itself, where we're seeing metals that would naturally have remained bound to the soil particles become dissociated. They then become dissolved in the groundwater, and we're seeing them leave that area, with the result that we're seeing higher heavy metals in most cases in water that's leaving that area. So kind of a little bit of a non-traditional version of the groundwater contamination sites. We're also sometimes seeing high chloride levels in groundwater, mostly due to the lowering of the groundwater tables, occasionally also associated with winter road maintenance activities. And then we are also seeing some elevated nitrates in groundwater in some areas of the state, usually associated with areas that have higher levels of agricultural activity. And then last on here, another challenge that we're seeing, again, not unique to us, but is that we are seeing impacts on the recharge rates of the groundwater in Michigan, largely tied to climate change. And so for more discussion on the climate change impacts, so we are seeing, of course, more intense precipitation events. And as we see those more intense precipitation events, as a result, we're seeing more frequent flooding. We're also seeing that stormwater infrastructure is being overwhelmed more often. And all of that tends to lead to, we have more water that's running off and going to surface water. It's having less time to sit on the ground, infiltrate, and recharge the groundwater. So we're seeing, in some cases, lower cases of recharge, just kind of recharging in different ways than we had seen with the patterns previously. We're also seeing that with the more frequent and intense precipitation events, that we're seeing more either failures of drain fields associated with on-site septic tank drain field systems, or just seeing more instances where those drain fields are saturated and then therefore not functioning appropriately, not functioning the way they should be for treatment of that sanitary sewage. That, of course, can pose a risk both to groundwater, pollution risk to groundwater and surface water, and poses a public health concern. And then on the flip side of that, we're also seeing more frequent and more significant periods of drought in Michigan. We do have a lot of agriculture in Michigan. So as a result, when we see more of the drought conditions, we're having a higher demand on groundwater for irrigation purposes. So that's just kind of stressing our aquifers a little bit more. We're also running into some issues where in certain parts of the state, new large water withdrawal wells cannot be approved for installation because too much of the groundwater in the aquifer is already allocated to other uses. And I know each state does things a little bit differently. In Michigan, we make the determinations on where large water withdrawal wells can go in based on the water use program, which utilizes the water withdrawal assessment tool, with the goal of that tool being to ensure that there's going to be enough water for direct human use and to ensure that we're protecting the environment. So primarily making sure that there's still enough of that groundwater that's venting to surface water to ensure that the organisms that are living in those aquatic habitats, so the rivers, lakes, and streams, that they're still getting enough of that venting recharge water into the surface waters that they need as well. We're also seeing in some areas, and it's usually a combination, drought condition, changes in that groundwater recharge, and then also just that kind of increased heavy groundwater use for the time periods when folks are needing to irrigate more. We've seen increasing salinity in public and private water supplies. And it's usually either a side effect of wells needing to be drilled deeper just because that aquifer is dropping, which then naturally gets that well closer to the deeper saline water, or as a side effect of increased cones of depression resulting from that increased groundwater supply that's just pulling up that deeper saline groundwater. For policy changes and how our state's policy is changing to address the challenges around groundwater management. So for Michigan, like I said, when we started kind of looking at what we have and what we don't have, we found that before we started making policy changes, we really needed to backtrack a little bit. First, we needed to address some of those challenges that we identified. The first main one being the lack of certain groundwater data that will be critical for making the well-informed, well-educated policy decisions. And then the second main one being that lack of easy access to all of the groundwater data that is currently available from all of the various sources. So for Eagle, our first step was to secure additional funding for groundwater data collection and funding for a database or warehouse style sort of system where all that groundwater data could be safely housed and be made easily available to anyone who wanted to use it. So with funding secured, we're now in the process of creating the Eagle Groundwater Data Management System. So that's going to be that warehouse or database system that will allow a safe place for all of the data across the state to be stored and then give everyone easy access to it. To address the missing data challenge, Eagle is partnering with universities and other agencies to create the Michigan Hydrologic Framework, which will create groundwater, surface water, models that will be able to access that update hydrologic data coming from the data management system, be able to perform comprehensive hydrologic analysis, and other groundwater models can also be created as needed. And then that segues into the research needs. So in terms of the research needs that we have in the state of Michigan and kind of how academic institutions can help meet those needs, so we're really seeing here that there's a need for additional refinement and research into three-dimensional glacial geology mapping. Some work is needed on glacial and bedrock aquifer sustainability studies, additional groundwater modeling, just kind of in general, but then also in particular with that interface with surface water, particularly lakes and streams, just kind of trying to figure out a little bit better how things are moving, why they're moving the way that they are. We need some more research into mapping the three-dimensional extent of groundwater contamination plumes. And that's both for those more kind of traditional site-specific industrial kind of point. We can identify the point of the discharge where the pollutant came from. And then also those more wide-ranging contamination issues. So like the elevated nitrates that we see in areas where there's more concentrated agricultural activity. We also, and this is kind of more of where my expertise comes in, but studies in long-term cost-effective wastewater treatment methods, particularly for the high-strength wastewater that's carrying those high nutrients or that high organic content to it, finding safe ways that can continue to be treated. And then finally, we need a better understanding of the social and ecological value of groundwater resources to allow or to support us making policy and decision-making, especially in terms of the risk management approaches for contaminated groundwater. Future research needs to consider the significance of groundwater to Michigan's economy, ecology, and identity, and evaluate the broader societal impacts of leaving pollutants in the ground. So when we can't necessarily get full treatment. And in terms of how academic institutions can help meet these research needs, I'd say, and just from my experience too, working with some of the academic institutions in Michigan, a lot of this is already being worked on. There's already a lot of interesting research going on with it, but there's always room for more. And I know we are on our side within the groundwater discharge program, we're always interested in seeing new discharge methods, new treatment methods that can be utilized. We try and make sure that our permitting can blend with those new methods, that we can support those new treatment systems to make sure that we don't want to be blocking things out that can offer proper treatment. So always opportunity, and we're always interested in hearing more if universities are working on something or studying something. And so I know there will be an opportunity at the end to ask any kind of follow-up questions. I do just have my contact information on here if anyone wants to reach out to me directly afterwards with any questions or to chat anything through. I'm always happy to do that. You're more than welcome to reach out to me. And then with that, I think I'll hand it back to Marissa for the next presenter.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rachel. So now we're going to move on to Steve.
Good afternoon, everyone. You should be able to see my screen now. Good afternoon. I'm Steve Elmore. I'm the director of the Drinking Water and Groundwater Program at Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. Glad to be here with everyone today. Groundwater is one of our sections in our program at groundwater management, and we also have a water use section that implements the Great Lakes Compact and approves high capacity well applications in the state. So in Wisconsin, we have the Groundwater Coordinating Council, which was established in the 1980s, and it's really used to coordinate non-regulatory groundwater activities. It's an information exchange, education, research, and research funding forum. And the council meets quarterly. We actually have a meeting this week of the council, and they annually provide a report to the Wisconsin state legislature on groundwater activities and sort of the state of groundwater in the state. This council does include the agencies listed on the screen there, and these are the agencies that annually also put out a solicitation for groundwater research projects, which every fall we gather projects submitted and make decisions. They're peer reviewed and reviewed as part of a research network nationally. And then some of these agencies, including our agency, the Department of Natural Resources, has funding for research and that we apply towards some of those projects that are submitted as a part of this joint solicitation for projects. I will note that the Department of Natural Resources, we do set groundwater standards for regulated activities that would affect groundwater in the state. And we do set those at levels recommended by our Department of Health Services. We've gone through 11 cycles of sending chemicals and naturally occurring contaminants over to our Department of Health Services for their review and recommendation for standards. So some of the challenges in Wisconsin, I would say our number one challenge in groundwater is nitrates and primarily impacts from industrial agriculture and septic systems in the state as the primary sources. You can see from the map here, the darker colors are counties where more than 15% of the private wells exceed the nitrate standard of the maximum contaminant level of 10. So so that's our number one problem. Of course, of recent, PFAS has been of concern, and that's due to the historic use and discharge to the land surface of those chemicals. And we are gaining a better understanding of PFAS. We do have now a state maximum contaminant level for PFOA and PFOS. Every public water system has been sampled, and we're also working with county health departments to sample private wells where we have a concern about PFAS contamination. Arsenic is naturally occurring in Wisconsin, particularly in the eastern part of Wisconsin, north and south, and we do have other contaminants such as radium, manganese, which are naturally occurring, and pesticides that we work closely with our Department of Agriculture, Trade, Consumer Protection on setting new groundwater standards, and they also do a survey every so often, I don't think it's annually, of pesticide contamination occurrence in groundwater statewide. In terms of groundwater quantity, we do have some concerns in Wisconsin, primarily in some areas of the north. We do have shallow depth to granite bedrock, so we have a limited lens of the sand and gravel aquifer in some locations that to provide water for use. We also have issues in eastern Wisconsin with an aquitard that does limit infiltration into the deep aquifer of groundwater. So we do have some drawdowns of the deep aquifer, and that was one of the drivers for the city of Waukesha to recently change their water source from groundwater to getting an approved diversion of Great Lakes water from the city of Milwaukee and Lake Michigan water source there. We do have some issues with surface water groundwater interaction, as Michigan also alluded to, and we have some areas where high capacity wells and the I guess frequency or number of high capacity wells in a particular area does cause impacts to surface water resources like streams and lakes. We have done recently a study in the central part of Wisconsin, the Central Sands Lake study, that documented that and showed that there were impacts to lakes there from pumping high capacity wells in that area of the state. So that's something we have ongoing research and challenges. Okay, climate impacts. In Wisconsin, we've been focused on looking at the impacts over time here, and a couple of things that I wanted to point out were groundwater flooding, and this graph on the right shows one county in Wisconsin where we charted out the groundwater levels, overlaid that with the precipitation record, and you can see that, you know, and this is not the only county where we see this. I mean, it's pretty much across the state where the groundwater levels will follow the long-term trend of precipitation events. And you can see there that in the late 2010s into 2020, we had many years of above average precipitation that then resulted in increased groundwater levels. And then you see a distinct drop off there after 2020 as drought became the norm the last couple years in particular. And so we're seeing a rapid drop in groundwater level. And as you drive around Wisconsin, you can sometimes see this. You can see where you know, an area might be dry now, but a couple of years ago it was starting to become a wetland with wetland plants and habitat there. So it has changed quite a bit, and we expect to see that with climate change that we will see these wide swings in groundwater levels moving forward. And that you can see here, the current situation in February of 2024, that we do have areas of Wisconsin that are in somewhat of a drought. And last summer, it was more of an issue. We brought together some resources, and there are some web pages at Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources that can further outline our work in these areas. Both of these are links on the slide here, but if you just search groundwater flooding Wisconsin or drought Wisconsin, these pages come up with more information. All right, groundwater management. The main things overseeing Wisconsin's groundwater are our groundwater standards, and we have currently over 130 groundwater standards, and you can find out more there on that webpage. And we do have something we call the Groundwater Retrieval Network that has all our groundwater data for the state that's searchable online, and you can see a link there to it. We're improving this database all the time, and it does allow us to share the information we have and allow researchers to answer their questions about groundwater in Wisconsin. The groundwater law in Wisconsin is established by the state legislature, and it really seeks to minimize the concentration of polluting substances in groundwater through the use of numerical standards that apply to all the groundwater regulatory programs in Wisconsin. The standards are used by all state agencies and programs. Most recently, we have made changes to the groundwater standards to address bacteria, and the changes to the Safe Drinking Water Act that affect how total coliform and E. coli are treated, and then we're also attempting to add PFAS groundwater standards to our list of standards. In terms of groundwater quantity management, we do have programs that aim for sustainable water use. The Great Lakes Compact is implemented out of our water use section, and our program requires registration and reporting of high capacity withdrawals of water from both groundwater and surface water. And we do review high capacity well applications statewide, and we deliver water use permits and oversee diversions in the Great Lakes Basin. According to case law in Wisconsin, groundwater withdrawals and water quantity impacts we must review all existing and proposed high capacity wells when we review a application, whether it to determine whether it harms a spring, a lake, or stream, whether it will affect a sensitive wetland or harm a municipal or private well water supply. So groundwater research. Wisconsin does, as I mentioned earlier, we have a robust process for soliciting groundwater research projects, and you can find out more on the webpage here that's run through our Groundwater Coordinating Council. And our current priorities include those here shown on the screen. And just one thing I want to note before wrapping up here is we do have a good history here of having research projects that allow us to then make good policy decisions around groundwater. And for instance, aldicarb was a chemical that was used in agriculture quite a bit in Wisconsin, and through research that was done through this program, aldicarb was withdrawn from use in Wisconsin. Also, our agriculture state agency did establish an atrazine rule that allowed for then reduction in levels of atrazine in groundwater, all through starting with research done through this program. And arsenic, it helps us understand the research has helped us understand the mineralogy around the state that contributes to that naturally occurring contaminant getting into drinking water. And of recent, we've had a lot of research on nitrates and how nutrient management plans are used, and unfortunately we find generally they're minimally effective at reducing groundwater nitrate levels, and also research on the occurrence, transport, and removal and management of nitrates in groundwater. We've had some research on viruses that shows that even deep aquifers are vulnerable to viruses that start due to surface activity on the surface. And also radium has helped protect people from drinking that contaminant, naturally occurring contaminant in Wisconsin. So that's the state of research right now, and that's it for me, and I'll stop sharing. So we can move on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. And now on to Walt.
Thank you. Can you all see this? Is that
Yes.
a yes? Yes. Okay.
Yes,
Thank you.
yeah.
Okay. So Illinois, I'm works for the Illinois State Water Survey, which is on the Prairie Research Institute at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. A lot of what I was going to say, or I'm going to say, has already been said by my colleagues from Michigan and Wisconsin, but we can go through, see what we got here. So, like the other states, there's a lot of different agencies that are involved in groundwater policy and research in Illinois. We have an Illinois Environmental Protection Agency. They're responsible for regulating community water supplies and all that entails. We have the Illinois Department of Public Health, which handles non-community and domestic wells, including acquiring the well logs and making sure that wells pass the initial nitrate and coliform tests. We do also have a DNR. They direct water supply planning in the state, although they have very little regulatory power when it comes to groundwater. And they're also responsible for ecological impacts, but that's mainly surface water. So my organization is the Illinois State Water Survey. We have no regulatory authority, but we are mainly a research institute. We do modeling, monitoring, and water quality. We also are archiving data in the state, including being the repository for all the well logs in the state. We run the water inventory program. We also provide scientific guidance for all things groundwater. And I should also mention, we also have the State Geological Survey here, who does a lot of the mapping, especially the three-dimensional mapping that they're starting to do now that go into our models. We also have a USGS office here. They mainly do water quality research. So some of the challenges we have are similar to what's going on in Michigan and Wisconsin. We have fairly weak laws in Illinois regarding groundwater use. We mainly accept the doctrine of reasonable use, and changes in water policy generally occur as a result of case law. Illinois' governing groundwater supply law is the Water Use Act of 1983, which was amended in 2010. And under that, high capacity users, which is greater than 70 gallons per minute, are mandated to supply annual withdrawals. But there's very little teeth in the law. There's really no penalty if you don't report. And in fact, prior to 2010, it was actually a voluntary program. Irrigators were required to start reporting in 2015, but reporting has generally been pretty poor from that sector, and oftentimes the reports are pretty crude estimates. And I'll just mention that water meters are not required for any reporting. Another challenge was, despite being in a water-rich region, we do have some unsustainable withdrawals. Most prominently, it was deep sandstone aquifers in the southwest suburbs of Chicago, generally centered around the city of Joliet. They've been cone of depression about 800 or 900 feet deep, and so it is dewatering some of the Ordovician Cambrian sandstone aquifers down there. This problem is being resolved primarily by communities switching to Lake Michigan water, so it's nice to have other options. But some communities which rely on the shallower, less threatened aquifers are also considering alternative sources due to water quality concerns. And these are the similar ones that were mentioned already, but probably the main one that's freaking people out now is PFAS, of course, having to remove that possibly to very low levels. Finally, domestic well users is a challenge. They're generally not well supported in general, at least partly intentionally, because many private well owners don't really appreciate any kind of government interference. The Illinois State Water Survey does host the privatewellclass.org program, which many of you might know about. If you don't, please contact me, because it's a really good resource for instructing private well owners and how to maintain their system and protect their water quality. So the effects of climate change are pretty similar to what's going on in Wisconsin and Michigan. Most of the effects we're seeing now are fairly subtle or indirect. The main long-term concern, I think, is how changing climate will affect recharge to shallow aquifers, as well as discharge to streams and the impact on wetlands. An indirect effect in Illinois is the increase in irrigation wells. This especially occurs in 1 or 2 years after a significant drought, like happened in 2012. And includes places where you would never consider irrigation in the past, places that have soils with good water holding capacity. But there's climate change drivers, there's pricing drivers, things like that, that are forcing many farmers to put in irrigation wells. And as a result, we're already seeing some long-term drawdowns in a couple of areas where irrigation has been expanding in some confined systems. In Illinois, water supply planning is primarily delegated to regional and local entities, so policy changes are probably more likely to be seen on those scales. However, last year, Illinois did release an updated state water plan, our first since 1984, and includes 147 recommendations, many of which will impact policy. Some of these include improving our water use data collection, including encouraging metering, updating local ordinances for emergency, mainly drought situations, ensuring that regional stakeholder committees are able to maintain an active presence by getting the funding they need, and establishing an integrated water information center. This would be similar to what Rachel in Michigan mentioned, but it's actually much broader than just groundwater. It includes surface water, stormwater, precipitation, things like that. And it's going to be housed at the Illinois State Water Survey. So my final slide, research needs are pretty much similar to what was mentioned for Michigan and Wisconsin. Sustainability is a big one, and of course that's a very difficult thing to actually even define. And communicating that concept with non-scientists is even more challenging. Our models have a degree of uncertainty that we need to communicate well to our stakeholders. Understanding, locating, and protecting recharge areas, improving our ability to understand and model groundwater surface water interactions, dealing with emerging contaminants, of course, PFAS and whatever is going to come down the road next. Seems like in my career, every 10 years, we have a new emerging contaminant that people get very concerned about. And other thing I'll mention that we're starting to look at very recently is a possible managed aquifer recharge project, which is unusual, I think, in a water-rich region such as we live in. And regarding the universities, I think training our future hydrogeologists and geochemists is probably the highest priority. But I'd also like to see more cooperation with the state agencies in designing thesis and capstone projects. And that way, students are working on real-time problems that might actually contribute to solving problems, as well as preparing students for the workforce. And with that, I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Walt. And thank you, Rachel and Steve and Walt, for serving on the panel. We have about 15 minutes for questions. So we've got a few in the Q&A. So I'm just going to read these out. So this first one is for Steve in the DNR. And it seems that there is a scientist listening in who is looking for a contact. They have put forth some research with nitrate and nitrite drinking water and groundwater information, and they haven't yet heard from the DNR. Haven't heard a response. So I'm wondering if you know of anyone that they should reach out to directly, or if they could email you directly for such information, or what do you suggest?
Yeah, I think emailing me or giving me a call, my contact information was included here, would probably be the best way to handle that. I mean, nitrate is something that we look at, and we do recognize that there is information to suggest that the nitrate standard should be lowered, that to be more protective of public health. And it's something we certainly talk with the health department about, and consider that. Unfortunately, I don't think we'd make any change to standards, groundwater standards in the state for nitrate or nitrite until the federal government makes a change to the Safe Drinking Water Act standards. So we're somewhat limited in what we can do, but it is something we discuss regularly with the health department.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Okay, and so that's from David Belloc. So thanks, David, for your question. And then John Adama has asked if the three of you can compare and contrast the effects of climate change on groundwater in the Great Lakes region versus other northern climates, specifically the Pacific Northwest or the upper New England area. And they're looking for a response as to whether we should expect the same type and severity of changes, or are there differences in the projections?
So I can start, I guess. I'm not totally familiar with all the climate change models that are going on, but I do know that in our region, we are expecting warmer but wetter conditions, whereas a lot of states to the south and southwest are seeing much drier conditions. So, I mean, in some senses, people talk about the Great Lakes Midwest region being kind of from a climate sense, better off than a lot of places in the country or even in the world. So, you know, we are probably going to see more frequent but short-term droughts, very intense flash droughts, as they're calling them. How that's going to impact groundwater recharge, I think, is very much an open question for research.
Thank you. Rachel or Steve, would you like to add anything?
I can just add, there have been quite a bit of projections and a lot of information in Wisconsin using the overall climate models. Our agency's been engaged with the university on the Wisconsin Initiative for Climate Change Impacts, or WICI, WICCI, and you can look up some of the projections there. And similar to what Walt referred to, we are expecting big changes back and forth from wet conditions to dry conditions, more extreme weather events, so I guess, yeah, we're going to need to be prepared for change. Really, is and it's not necessarily more wet or more dry, but it'll fluctuate.
And that's consistent too for Michigan. Our agency department has been trying to gear up for those changes to happen quicker. So whereas we may have seen, and anyone who's on the Great Lakes knows this too, but whereas we may have seen those higher Great Lakes level and then those dropping Great Lake levels in the past, where we had maybe 10 or 15, 20 years in between those cycles, we're seeing those shorten, where it might be 5 years cycling in between, for example. So we're just kind of trying to gear up for that as best we can. And from the regulatory standpoint too, we're trying to make sure that in particular, because I work with wastewater discharges, that our wastewater discharge infrastructure is going to be able to keep functioning even when we have those high water events and low water events.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to the next. There's a mention and a shout out from the University of Wisconsin Water Resources Institute. So this is Jen Hawkswell. Hi, Jen. And it looks like in partnership with the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection, there's a postgraduate fellowship opportunity focused on better understanding atrazine in groundwater. So that's exciting and pertains to this. So I just wanted to read it, but I believe everyone can see the Q&A. Otherwise, I'm sure the Freshwater Collaborative will be sharing that opportunity out as well. And then people can look for it through the Water Resources Institute at UW-Madison. Thanks. Okay, from Ed Weinberg, we have, do any of the state groundwater quality representatives on the panel know of previous collaboration with universities in grant opportunities offered by the USDA, NIFA, AFRI programs, specifically on novel groundwater nitrate reduction methods?
Well, maybe I could start. I'm not sure I'm familiar off the top of my head with specifically with USDA. One thing though I'd mention is we do have a long-term project with researchers at UW-Madison to work on what we're calling a nitrate decision support tool that can be used by farmers out in the field, making decisions about how much fertilizer to add to their crops, that this will help make those decisions to minimize leaching nitrate to groundwater. And yeah, we've been working on that for several years, and do have a product that's usable, but we're continuing to refine that and make it better. So, and that funding is mostly through the set-asides of the Safe Drinking Water Revolving Loan Fund, federal money.
And likewise, I'm not aware of anything with USDA directly. I do know, particularly in the Western Lake Erie Basin for Michigan, there's quite a bit of funding, and some of that's coming through the NRCS. So kind of still coming through to the farms for some treatment systems, primarily in Western Lake Erie Basin. It's associated with treatment of tile runoff coming from agricultural fields that might be higher in nitrogen and phosphorus, trying to capture and kind of just give some settling and uptake time for that water before it goes out to the surface water and out to the lake. So kind of relate, not tied like to the sanitary sewage portion of it, but I have seen there's some interesting funding and research going on, particularly in the Western Lake Erie Basin in Michigan, looking at different methods for trying to slow down some of that nutrient transport.
Wonderful. Thanks. Okay, from Dan Nickmeyer, generally, are all 3 states waiting on EPA for PFAS regulation, or are you moving ahead with regulations in the meantime?
Go ahead,
I
Rachel.
see. Oh, okay. Yeah, fight you there for who could unmute first. So in Michigan, we do have regulation both for drinking water, and we do have criteria for groundwater, for PFAS and PFOA, and then for several other parameters. So we do and are enforcing that in the state of Michigan.
So in Wisconsin, we do have a maximum contaminant level for public drinking water systems for PFOA and PFOS. That is set at a relatively high level of 70 parts per trillion individually and combined. We are looking at the federal proposed MCLs, and we'll adopt those once they're finalized by the federal government. But last year we did test all public water systems for PFAS, and we have those results, and we're following up with those systems, and certainly a lot of the federal money that's available will be useful to systems to drill new wells or install treatment if they are impacted at any level by PFAS in Wisconsin. And we are moving forward. We have proposed a groundwater standard for PFAS, including PFOA and PFOS. That sits currently with our legislature for their action. The other thing I'd note is we are working with local health departments to test private wells when we are aware of contamination in an area. Say if a public well had elevated levels of PFAS, we would like to support the testing of private wells around those locations to make sure the private well owners aren't impacted.
Yeah, and I'll just say for Illinois, I'm not in a regulatory agency, but my understanding is it's similar to Wisconsin. We're kind of waiting on the feds, and we'll adopt those standards once they're promulgated. And also like Wisconsin, the Illinois EPA sampled all the public supply wells and intakes in the state, I think 2 years ago, looking for PFAS. And my memory is that they found a detection in about 17% of the wells and intakes. So definitely a problem.
Wow. Thank you. Okay, moving on to a question from Neil O'Reilly. Many states rely on ambient groundwater standards versus discharge point standards. This approach means a problem has to exist before an action is taken. As we know, once the groundwater is contaminated, it's hard or impossible to clean up. Don't we need a better approach? What would the panel recommend? That's a great question, Neil. Thank you.
Yeah, that is a good question. In Wisconsin, our groundwater law requires us to take action when a substance is either found in groundwater or we have reasonable information, or something like, I'm paraphrasing here, but reasonable information to believe that it could be found in groundwater. And so, we use that, charge to then propose new groundwater standards. So if we are, I don't know if petition the word, if an agency or organization comes to us and says, hey, you should think about regulating this substance in groundwater, we then put that down on a list and we submit that to Department of Health Services for their recommendation. Toxicologists at the Department of Health Services review that and send us back a recommendation on what, if any, the groundwater standard should be. for that particular substance. And that's the process in Wisconsin state law. And then we take those recommendations and we propose a new administrative rule change and go through that process, where in our agency, the governor's office and the state legislature all have a chance to review those potential changes before it becomes law. And so that's the general process in Wisconsin, but it does allow for, or, you know, part of the process is not just that it's already in groundwater. It might be that, hey, this is used out in agriculture, for instance, and we're concerned that it might get into groundwater.
And in the state of Michigan, we have the Part 22 Groundwater Quality Administrative Rules. They are rules promulgated by the state of Michigan as part of NREPA. So we actually have and issue permits. That's my day-to-day work, is working with the compliance staff for permits that are issued to point source discharges that discharge to groundwater. And we have a whole gamut of facilities that our rules are applicable to. There are some smaller discharges and certain residential discharges that are exempted from requiring a state groundwater discharge permit. But most, if it's any form of treated sanitary sewage or industrial commercial type of wastewater, it requires a groundwater discharge permit in the state of Michigan if it's being discharged to the ground surface or to the groundwater. If anyone wants more information on that, or if you're looking for some real great reading, the Part 22 rules are available online, and they go through all the different types of facilities that our rules are applicable to. But so in the state of Michigan, we do have a permitting process for those facilities that are discharging. If anyone's familiar with the MPDS permitting process from the federal level, it's very similar, but a state-run program.
Walt, would you like to add anything?
No, not being a regulator, I'm not really on the
Okay.
ground on this sort of thing, so.
Okay,
sorry.
sounds good. Well, looking at the clock, I just wanted to, I'm sorry we weren't able to answer every question, nor were we able to answer in the depth that everyone would appreciate. I hope that this symposium is able to connect people with answers and collaborations for the future. If you are interested in staying involved, we hope that you're interested in staying involved. We ask that you please connect with the Freshwater Collaborative. We've just started a new LinkedIn page that you all can sign up for. You can also visit our website at freshwater.wisconsin.edu to sign up for our quarterly newsletters. And please keep an eye open. We will be hosting our next quarterly symposium in late April, early May, where we'll be talking about water resources management on Indigenous lands within the boundaries of the United States, and how that is a complex issue hampered by the lack of high quality and easily accessible databases, with Dr. Grace Bulltail. So thank you so much for your time and attention and participation today. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to the GLHEC for co-hosting this with the Freshwater Collaborative. And we wish you all a great Tuesday.